The hospital, after midnight, moved at a slower rhythm. Lights in the main corridors were dimmed to a soft amber, enough for staff to move safely, but gentle enough not to disturb sleeping patients. Monitors hummed in steady tones behind half-closed doors, and the occasional rolling cart echoed softly across polished floors. The night shift was always thinner, quieter, almost suspended between the exhaustion of the day and the uncertainty of morning. Most of the city outside had already fallen into darkness, but inside the hospital, the work never stopped. At the far end of the surgical recovery ward, the night nurse walked with steady, unhurried steps. Her name on the badge read, Elena Carter, RN. To most of the staff, she was simply the dependable night nurse who had been working this rotation for several months. She rarely spoke unless necessary. She never rushed. Her charting was precise, her medication timings exact. People trusted her work, even if they barely noticed her presence. She moved quietly between patient rooms, pausing briefly at each doorway before entering, her eyes adjusting to the darker spaces inside. A man recovering from abdominal surgery shifted slightly in his sleep as she adjusted the drip on his IV line. Another patient murmured softly while she checked the oxygen saturation monitor clipped to his finger. Everything appeared routine, the kind of quiet night nurses often hoped for. But Elena's movements carried a subtle precision that most people did not recognize. Before entering each room, she glanced once down the hallway, not casually, but carefully. Her eyes passed over the ceiling, where small security cameras were mounted in recessed domes. She never stared long enough to make it obvious. Just a brief look, a confirmation. When she stepped back into the corridor after finishing a chart update, she instinctively positioned herself so she could see both ends of the hallway at the same time. To the other nurses working the shift, it simply looked like habit. To Elena, it was awareness. At the central station, a young nurse named Daniel rubbed his eyes while scrolling through electronic patient files on the computer. "Quiet tonight," he muttered, half hoping not to jinx it. Elena set a clipboard down beside him and nodded slightly. "So far," she said. Her voice was calm and even, neither optimistic nor worried. Daniel glanced up at her with a tired smile. "You always say it like that." Elena did not respond. Instead, she reviewed the medication schedule displayed on the monitor, scanning it quickly. Her eyes moved faster than most people would expect from someone appearing so relaxed. A small clock above the desk showed 1:17 a.m. Outside the ward windows, the parking lot lights glowed in pale circles across empty asphalt. From somewhere deeper in the hospital came the faint rolling sound of a stretcher being moved along another corridor. A few seconds later, the elevator down the hall chimed softly. Elena's head turned toward the sound, without any visible urgency. The elevator doors opened and two orderlies stepped out, pushing a supply cart stacked with clean linens. They rolled past the nurse's station, nodding politely as they continued toward the storage room. Elena watched them for less than a second before returning her attention to the chart. Nothing unusual. Still, she made a small note in the back of her mind. Supply deliveries at that hour were not common, not impossible, but unusual. She picked up a patient chart and walked toward room 312. Inside, an elderly woman slept quietly with a nasal oxygen line resting across her cheeks. The monitor beside her bed traced a slow, steady heartbeat. Elena adjusted the blanket slightly where it had slipped from the patient's shoulder. The woman stirred for a moment and opened her eyes halfway. "Is it morning yet?" she whispered. Elena offered a small, reassuring smile. "Not yet. Try to rest." The patient nodded and closed her eyes again. Elena finished checking the IV bag and stepped back into the hallway. As she closed the door gently behind her, her gaze drifted again toward the far end of the corridor. A security guard passed through the intersection near the elevators, walking his usual patrol route. Elena had seen him several times during the shift already. His pace tonight was slightly slower than normal. She noticed small things like that without trying. Patterns mattered. Consistency mattered. When patterns shifted even a little, Elena noticed. At the nurse's station, Daniel had started preparing medication cups for the next scheduled round. Another nurse, Melissa, leaned against the counter while quietly complaining about how long the shift still felt. 3 more hours, she sighed. "Feels like a lifetime." Elena placed the updated chart back into its slot. "It will pass," she said. Melissa laughed softly. You say that like you're not tired. Elena simply gave a small shrug. Fatigue was part of the job, but she had learned long ago how to operate through it without letting it slow her thinking. The hallway lights flickered once, barely noticeable, just a brief dip in brightness before stabilizing again. Daniel frowned slightly and looked up at the ceiling. Electrical again? He muttered. Elena watched the lights for a second longer than the others. Then she continued down the hall for the next patient check. At 1:34 a.m., the emergency department called upstairs. The phone at the station rang twice before Melissa answered it. Her expression changed slightly as she listened. Surgical recovery? She said. Yes, we have space. She paused. Unknown male? Transfer from an outside incident? Another pause. All right, send him up. Melissa hung up and turned to the others. We're getting a late admission, trauma case, stabilized downstairs, but they want him monitored overnight. Daniel groaned softly. There goes the quiet shift. Elena said nothing, but her attention sharpened slightly. What kind of trauma? She asked calmly. Melissa checked the note scribbled on the pad beside the phone. Looks like blunt force injuries, maybe a fall or accident. They weren't very clear. Elena nodded once. Vague reports were common during overnight transfers, but something about the wording made her pause. Not enough information? A few minutes later, the elevator doors opened again. This time, the sound of a rolling stretcher echoed down the hallway. 2 paramedics guided the bed carefully toward the ward, while a doctor walked beside them, reviewing paperwork. The man on the stretcher was unconscious. His face showed bruising along the jawline, and a bandage wrapped around his shoulder beneath the hospital gown. An oxygen mask covered part of his face. Elena stepped forward automatically, taking position near the head of the bed as it arrived. Room ready, she said. The doctor handed her the clipboard. Male, mid-30s, found near an industrial site outside the city. Possible assault, but nothing confirmed. He was semi-conscious during transport, but faded out before arrival. Elena scanned the report quickly while the patient was wheeled into room 318. The injuries were documented, but the circumstances were vague. No confirmed identification yet. No family contact listed. That alone was not unusual. But Elena noticed something else. The man's hands. Even while unconscious, the small scars along the knuckles and fingers suggested someone used to physical training. His breathing pattern was controlled, deeper than most sedated trauma patients. Small details, easy to miss. Elena adjusted the monitor leads while Daniel connected the IV pump. The patient remained still, his face partially shadowed beneath the room's dim light. Another mystery patient, Daniel said quietly as he stepped back. Elena finished checking the monitor readings and wrote the initial observation into the chart. Then she stood still for a moment beside the bed. Something about the situation felt incomplete. Not dangerous yet. Just incomplete. In the hallway outside, the night shift returned to its quiet routine. But as Elena stepped back into the corridor, her eyes once again scanned both directions before she walked away. Patterns had changed, only slightly, but enough for her to notice. And somewhere deep in the building, something had begun moving that the rest of the hospital had not yet seen. At the nurse's station, Daniel looked up from the computer. Everything good? He asked. Elena set the chart down slowly. Her expression remained calm, almost indifferent. For now, she replied. Then she turned toward the hallway again, already watching and waiting. The ward settled back into its quiet rhythm after the new patient was admitted, but the atmosphere had shifted in a way that was difficult for most people to describe. The monitors continued their steady beeping. Nurses moved between rooms with routine efficiency. Yet the presence of the unidentified man in room 318 seemed to pull a thin thread of tension through the corridor. Elena Carter stood at the nurse's station, reviewing his chart more carefully now. The intake notes from the emergency department were brief. Male, approximately mid-30s. Found injured near an industrial site outside the city limits. Brought in by paramedics responding to a late-night call from a security patrol. No wallet, no phone, no identification. The attending physician had listed the injuries as moderate trauma. A dislocated shoulder that had been reset, bruising along the ribs, and a mild concussion. Nothing immediately life-threatening. Still, the lack of detail surrounding how he arrived there made the situation feel incomplete. Elena placed the chart back into its slot and looked down the hallway toward room 318. The door remained half closed, the dim light inside casting a narrow strip across the floor. Most trauma patients either woke quickly once stabilized or remained deeply sedated for hours, but this one had already shown brief moments of awareness during transport according to the report. She stepped away from the station and walked toward the room, her footsteps quiet against the polished floor. Inside, the patient lay exactly where they had left him. The oxygen mask fogged slightly with each slow breath. The heart monitor displayed a stable rhythm. Elena checked the IV line first, ensuring the medication flow remained steady. Then she gently lifted the edge of the blanket to examine the bandaged shoulder. The swelling had not worsened. Everything appeared medically consistent with the report. But Elena's eyes lingered on the man's hands again. The knuckles were rough with old scars that had healed long ago, not the kind caused by random accidents. The skin across his fingers carried the subtle marks of repeated pressure and friction. Training marks. She lowered the blanket and wrote a brief observation in the chart. Behind her, the patient's breathing shifted slightly. Elena turned back toward the bed just as the man's eyelids moved. His eyes opened halfway, unfocused at first. Patients waking from concussion often appeared disoriented, struggling to understand their surroundings. But the man's gaze moved differently. His eyes scanned the room once, quickly, deliberately, before settling on the ceiling. Elena remained still, watching quietly. "You're in a hospital," she said calmly. "You were brought in with injuries. Try not to move yet." The man's eyes shifted toward her voice. For a moment, his expression revealed nothing at all. Then his gaze drifted again, this time toward the door. It was not the confused look of someone trying to understand where he was. It was a measured look, as if he were studying the exit. Elena noticed it immediately. Most people would not have. The moment passed quickly. The man's eyes closed again, and his breathing returned to its slow, steady rhythm. Elena adjusted the oxygen mask slightly and stepped away from the bed. Before leaving the room, she looked once more at the patient monitor. Stable vitals. No sudden changes. Still, something about that brief moment of awareness stayed in her mind. She returned to the hallway and quietly closed the door behind her. At the nurse's station, Daniel glanced up from the computer. "He wake up?" he asked. "Briefly," Elena replied. "Nothing unusual." Daniel nodded and returned to his work. Across the corridor, Melissa was organizing medication trays for the next round. "We should be done with most checks before 3, she said. "If nothing else shows up." Elena did not respond immediately. Her attention had drifted toward the elevators again. The hallway there remained empty for a few seconds. Then the doors opened quietly. A man stepped out wearing a dark jacket and carrying a small messenger bag. Visitors during overnight hours were rare, but not impossible. Hospitals operated around the clock, and sometimes family members arrived late after receiving news of an accident or emergency. But this man did not approach the reception desk downstairs. Instead, he walked slowly down the corridor toward the ward, glancing briefly at room numbers as he passed. Elena watched him from the station without appearing to stare. His posture was controlled, his pace unhurried. When he reached the intersection near the ward entrance, he paused, looking around as if confirming directions. Then he continued walking past the nurse's station. "Excuse me," he said politely. "I'm looking for a patient who was admitted tonight, male, mid-30s. Melissa looked up. "Do you have a name?" she asked. The man hesitated for half a second. "I'm not sure if it was registered yet. He was brought in from an accident near the industrial district." Melissa checked the admission list on the computer. "We did receive a trauma case," she said. "But visitors usually need approval first." The man nodded calmly. "I understand. I'm a colleague. Just wanted to confirm he's okay." Elena studied his face quietly while the conversation continued. His tone remained relaxed, but there was a careful precision in the way he spoke. People often revealed more through small hesitations than through words themselves. "He's stable," Melissa said. "But he's not awake yet. You'll probably have to check back in the morning." The man accepted the answer without argument. "Thank you," he said. He turned and walked back toward the elevators, disappearing behind the closing doors a moment later. Daniel looked up from his screen. Friend maybe, he said, or coworker. Melissa shrugged. Probably heard about the accident. Elena said nothing. Instead, she stood quietly for a moment, her eyes focused on the elevator panel across the hall. Something about the man's visit felt incomplete in the same quiet way the patient's arrival had felt earlier, a pattern forming, but not yet visible. 10 minutes later, another small shift occurred. The security guard who had been patrolling earlier passed through the corridor again, but this time he stopped briefly near the elevators to speak into his radio. His voice was too quiet to hear clearly. Elena watched him from the corner of her eye while pretending to review another chart. The guard finished speaking and continued down the hall, his pace slightly faster than before. Elena walked toward room 318 again, a few minutes later. The hallway remained calm. Nothing outwardly unusual. Inside the room, the patient still appeared asleep. But when she checked the monitor, she noticed a small change in his heart rate, slightly elevated compared to earlier readings. Not dangerous, just different. She stood beside the bed for a moment, observing him closely. "You can hear more than you show," she said quietly, almost as if speaking to herself. The man did not respond. His breathing remained steady. But Elena knew the difference between unconsciousness and controlled stillness. She adjusted the IV pump again and stepped back toward the door. Before leaving, she glanced once more at the patient's hands resting above the blanket, the scars, the tension in the fingers even while still. Someone trained to endure pain without showing it. In the hallway, the night remained calm. Yet Elena felt the quiet pressure of unseen movement building somewhere beyond the walls of the ward. Something had brought that man into the hospital. Something had already begun looking for him. And the rest of the staff continued their work without realizing that the quiet shift they expected was already changing shape. At the nurse's station, Daniel stretched and yawned. "Still quiet," he said. Elena returned the chart to its place and looked once more down the corridor toward room 318. "Not for long," she said softly. The others barely noticed the words, but Elena was already watching the patterns tighten, and somewhere outside the hospital, people were beginning to move toward the building with far greater urgency than anyone inside yet understood. By 2:18 a.m., the hospital appeared unchanged from the outside. The emergency entrance remained quiet. The parking lot lights cast long, pale circles across the pavement. Inside, the night shift continued its steady rhythm of patient checks and chart updates. Yet beyond the outer perimeter of the hospital grounds, several dark vehicles rolled silently into position along the surrounding streets. They arrived without sirens and without headlights, stopping one by one in carefully spaced intervals. From the upper floors, no one inside the hospital could see the coordinated movement forming beyond the building. Inside the surgical recovery ward, Elena Carter continued moving through her routine, as if nothing had changed. She finished checking the medication schedule at the nurse's station and walked toward the far end of the hallway where room 318 remained dim and quiet. The door was still partially closed. The patient monitor inside cast a faint green glow across the wall. Elena stepped inside and gently shut the door behind her. The man in the bed remained motionless, but the heart monitor revealed what his posture concealed. His pulse had increased slightly again, still controlled, but no longer resting. Elena adjusted the oxygen mask and checked the IV line with careful, deliberate movements. As she leaned closer to check the bandage on his shoulder, she spoke in a voice quiet enough that it would barely travel beyond the bed. "They're closer now." The man's eyelids moved almost imperceptibly, not enough for anyone else to notice, but Elena saw it clearly. His breathing remained steady, his eyes still closed, but the tension in his hands increased slightly. A controlled reaction. Elena finished adjusting the bandage and stepped back. "You should keep resting," she said calmly, this time loud enough to sound like a normal nurse's instruction. She turned and left the room without waiting for a response. Back at the nurse's station, Daniel was reviewing lab reports on the computer screen while Melissa prepared another round of medication trays. The atmosphere remained calm, though the earlier quiet conversation had faded. Elena glanced briefly at the wall clock. 2:24 a.m. Outside the building, more vehicles had arrived. Tactical officers moved quietly between them, communicating through low radio transmissions. Their positions formed a careful perimeter around the hospital. No alarms had been raised yet. The operation was moving forward silently. Inside the hospital lobby, two plainclothes agents entered through the main doors and approached the night security desk. Their conversation with the guard lasted less than 30 seconds before the guard's posture stiffened slightly. He nodded and picked up the phone behind the desk. On the recovery ward floor, the elevator chimed again. Elena looked up automatically. Two men stepped out, both dressed in dark jackets similar to the visitor who had arrived earlier. Their appearance alone was not suspicious, but their timing was precise. They walked down the hallway with the relaxed confidence of people who already knew where they were going. Daniel noticed them as they approached. "Can we help you?" he asked. One of the men offered a polite smile. "We're looking for the trauma patient admitted tonight," he said. "Friend of ours." Melissa frowned slightly. "Visiting hours ended hours ago," she replied. The second man leaned slightly against the counter, still smiling. "We won't be long." Elena watched them quietly from the side of the station. Her posture remained calm, almost indifferent, but her mind had already begun measuring the situation. Two men, calm but focused. Their eyes moved across the hallway in small, quick observations before returning to the staff. Not concerned about being noticed, concerned about something else. "You'll need to wait until morning," Melissa repeated firmly. For a moment, the hallway fell silent. The two men exchanged a brief glance with each other. Then the first man nodded. "Of course," he said. "We understand." They turned and walked back toward the elevators. Daniel exhaled softly once they were gone. "Strange night for visitors," he muttered. Elena did not respond. Her gaze remained fixed on the elevator doors long after they closed. At 2:31 a.m., the first quiet signal reached the hospital administration office upstairs. A call from federal authorities requesting immediate cooperation. Within minutes, the hospital's internal communication system carried a short-coded message to senior security personnel. No alarms were triggered, no public announcement was made. The instructions were simple: maintain normal operations and avoid alerting anyone unnecessarily. On the recovery ward floor, Elena stepped away from the nurse's station again. "I'm checking 318, she said calmly. Daniel nodded without looking up. Inside the room, the patient's eyes opened the moment the door closed. The movement was controlled, silent. For the first time since his arrival, he looked directly at Elena with full awareness. "They're here," he said quietly through the oxygen mask. His voice was rough but steady. Elena stood beside the bed, her expression calm. "Yes," she replied. The man studied her face for a moment, searching for uncertainty or fear. He found neither. "How many?" he asked. Elena checked the monitor once more, as if finishing a routine task. "Enough," she said. The man let out a slow breath and closed his eyes again. Not surrender, calculation. Elena lowered her voice slightly. "They will secure the building soon. You should not try to move." A faint smile touched the corner of his mouth beneath the oxygen mask. "You assume I can't." Elena did not answer. Instead, she adjusted the blanket and checked the IV pump again. Outside the room, the corridor remained calm. But at that same moment, federal tactical teams had begun entering the hospital through multiple access points: stairwells, service corridors, the emergency entrance. Their movements were quiet and controlled, designed to avoid panic among patients and staff. On the surgical recovery ward floor, the elevator chimed again. This time, two uniformed hospital security officers stepped out, walking quickly toward the nurse's station. Daniel looked up. "Everything okay?" he asked. One of the guards nodded. "Just routine checks," he said. Elena stepped back into the hallway from room 318 just in time to hear the answer. She glanced once toward the elevators again. More movement was coming. She could feel it building in the small shifts of behavior around her. The guards continued down the corridor, checking doors and speaking quietly into their radios. Melissa watched them with mild confusion. "What's going on tonight?" she whispered. Daniel shrugged. "Probably something downstairs." Elena returned the patient chart to the station counter and looked once more at the hallway stretching toward room 318. Her movements remained steady, unhurried, but every position in the corridor had already been measured in her mind. Every doorway, every blind corner. The hospital staff still believed the disturbance was outside the ward. They believed the visitors had simply left. They believed the patient in room 318 was just another injured man recovering from an accident. But Elena understood something none of them did yet. The building was no longer simply a hospital tonight. It had become the center of an operation that had been moving quietly for hours, and the moment when that hidden tension would finally surface was getting closer with every passing minute. Daniel glanced at her again from the computer screen. "You okay?" he asked casually. Elena nodded once. "Yes." Her voice remained calm, but her eyes had already returned to the hallway, because she knew something the others did not. The tactical teams surrounding the hospital were not searching for the man in room 318 anymore. They were waiting for a signal from someone already inside the ward, and that signal had not been given yet. By 2:43 a.m., the pressure surrounding the hospital had become almost physical, though most of the staff inside the recovery ward still could not see it clearly. They noticed small things: security guards moving more frequently through the corridors, quiet radio conversations near the elevators, the faint presence of unfamiliar personnel appearing briefly at hallway intersections before disappearing again. But hospitals often experienced unusual nights, and the staff had learned not to question every irregular detail. Elena Carter stood at the nurses' station, reviewing a chart, her expression calm as always. To Daniel and Melissa, she looked exactly as she had looked for the past several hours, focused on routine work, steady and composed. What they did not see was the silent calculation continuing behind that calm surface. Every movement in the ward had meaning now. The guards passing through the corridor were not random patrols. The brief appearance of 2 plainclothes men near the elevators 10 minutes earlier had not been accidental. Outside the hospital, the perimeter had already been secured. Elena knew this without needing confirmation. She had watched the pattern build slowly since the patient arrived. The operation had reached its final stage, but the final stage still required one thing: a decision. Down the hallway, room 318 remained quiet. The door was still partially closed, just as it had been for the past hour. Elena picked up the patient chart and walked toward the room once more. Her pace remained steady, the same unhurried steps the staff had seen all night. Inside the room, the man in the bed was no longer pretending to sleep. His eyes opened the moment she entered. The oxygen mask still covered part of his face, but the alertness in his gaze was unmistakable. He watched her carefully as she closed the door behind her. "You've been busy," he said quietly. His voice was stronger now. Elena set the chart on the small table beside the bed. "You should still be resting," she replied. The man studied her face for several seconds. There was a calm intelligence in his expression, the kind that came from years of experience in situations where survival depended on reading people quickly. "You knew before anyone else," he said. It was not a question. Elena adjusted the IV pump without answering. The man's eyes shifted briefly toward the door, then back to her. "Federal teams," he said softly. "Outer perimeter first, quiet entry teams next." Elena finished adjusting the pump and looked at the monitor. "Your heart rate is rising again." A faint smile appeared in his eyes. "You're not denying it." Elena finally looked directly at him. The calm neutrality she had shown all night remained, but something deeper now sat behind it. "This is a hospital," she said quietly. "Patients here are not part of your situation." The man watched her for a long moment. Then he nodded slightly, as if confirming something he had suspected since the moment he woke up earlier. "You're not just a nurse." The statement hung in the air between them. Elena did not answer immediately. Instead, she picked up the chart again and flipped to the next page as if reviewing routine information. Outside the room, footsteps passed in the hallway. 2 security officers speaking quietly with someone near the nurse's station. The man listened carefully to the distant voices before speaking again. "They're waiting for you," he said. Elena closed the chart. For the first time since entering the room, her posture shifted slightly. Not into aggression, not into authority, but into something calmer and more deliberate. "Yes," she said simply. The man exhaled slowly through the oxygen mask. "So that's it." His gaze moved to the ceiling for a moment. "You waited until they were in position." Elena remained still. "I waited until the ward was secure," she replied. The distinction mattered. The man seemed to understand that. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the heart monitor filled the room. Then the man turned his head slightly toward her again. "You could signal them now," he said. Elena said nothing. "They would come through that door within 30 seconds, he continued calmly. "Maybe less." Elena's expression did not change. The man's voice softened slightly. "But that would involve weapons in a hospital ward." He let the sentence remain unfinished. Elena looked toward the door briefly. The hallway beyond remained calm, but she knew what was positioned there. Tactical teams ready to move the moment she gave the signal. Their instructions were clear: secure the suspect, avoid civilian harm. But operations rarely unfolded exactly as planned once movement began. The man in the bed watched her quietly. "You understand the risk," he said. Elena stepped closer to the bed and checked the bandage on his shoulder again. Her hands moved with professional precision, adjusting the tape slightly. "You're injured," she said. "Your shoulder will not hold if you try to fight." The man almost laughed, though the oxygen mask turned the sound into a quiet breath. "That's not what you're worried about." Elena finished the adjustment and stepped back. For a moment, her gaze rested on the patient monitor again, studying the steady pulse line. When she spoke, her voice remained calm. "This ward has 14 patients tonight." The man remained silent. "2 of them cannot be moved quickly," she continued. "One is recovering from heart surgery. Another is on oxygen support." The man understood immediately. Tactical entry would risk chaos. Chaos inside a hospital ward could harm people who had nothing to do with the situation. Elena met his eyes again. "If they enter forcefully, people will panic." The man nodded slowly. "And if they wait?" he asked. Elena did not answer right away. Instead, she walked to the small sink near the wall and washed her hands carefully, as if completing another routine task. The man watched her with quiet curiosity. Finally, she turned back toward him. "If they wait," she said calmly, "you will leave this room with me." The man's eyes narrowed slightly. Not anger, evaluation. "You think I'll cooperate?" Elena held his gaze without hesitation. "You will," she said. For several seconds, the room remained silent again. Then the man closed his eyes briefly, considering the situation. When he opened them again, the faint smile had returned. "You're protecting your patients," he said. Elena said nothing. The man studied her face once more before nodding slowly. "All right," he said quietly. Elena reached into the pocket of her uniform and removed a small communication device, one that had not been visible to anyone else during the shift. She pressed a single button and spoke in a low, controlled voice. "Ward secure. No forced entry required." The reply came through the device almost immediately. Elena listened without speaking, then turned the device off. Outside the room, nothing seemed to change. The hallway remained calm. The nurses at the station continued their work. But the tactical team surrounding the hospital had just received new instructions. No breach, controlled transfer only. Inside room 318, the man watched Elena place the device back into her pocket. "Federal agent," he said quietly. Elena picked up the chart again. "Tonight," she replied. Then she opened the door and stepped back into the quiet hallway, as if nothing unusual had happened at all. At 3:02 a.m., the surgical recovery ward looked exactly the same as it had an hour earlier. The overhead lights remained dim. Monitors continued their steady rhythms behind closed doors. Nurses moved quietly between patient rooms, completing their routine checks. To anyone walking through the hallway, the hospital night shift appeared calm and ordinary. Yet beneath that calm surface, a carefully controlled operation was moving toward its final step. Elena Carter stood at the nurse's station reviewing the last round of medication charts while Daniel typed notes into the computer beside her. Melissa stacked empty medication trays near the counter. The earlier appearance of extra security officers had already faded from their attention. Hospitals often had strange nights, and staff learned to focus on their work rather than every unusual detail. Elena glanced briefly at the wall clock. 3:05 a.m. Then she picked up the chart for room 318. "I'm transferring the trauma patient downstairs," she said calmly. Daniel looked up. "Now?" Elena nodded. "Observation unit requested him for imaging." Daniel accepted the explanation without question. Transfers during the night were common enough, especially when additional scans were needed. "Need help?" he asked. "I've got it," Elena replied. She walked down the hallway toward room 318 with the same steady pace she had used all night. Inside the room, the man in the bed was already awake. The oxygen mask still covered part of his face, and the bandaged shoulder remained secured against movement. But the tension in his posture had shifted. Not resistance. Preparation. Elena closed the door behind her and walked to the bedside. For a moment, neither of them spoke. The quiet hum of the monitor filled the room again. Then, Elena began disconnecting the portable monitoring leads with practiced efficiency. "They're ready," she said quietly. The man watched her movements. "No breach team?" he asked. "No," Elena replied. "Not tonight." He nodded once, accepting the outcome. Elena unlocked the wheels on the hospital bed and checked the portable oxygen tank attached to the frame. Her movements were calm, methodical. To anyone outside the room, it would appear like a routine patient transfer. "You understand what happens next," she said quietly. The man looked toward the ceiling for a moment before answering. "Federal custody," he said. "Interrogation. Charges." Elena did not comment. Instead, she finished securing the IV pump to the transport rail and moved to the head of the bed. "Try not to move your shoulder," she added. The man allowed a faint breath of amusement through the oxygen mask, still giving medical instructions. Elena opened the door and guided the bed slowly into the hallway. Daniel glanced up as she approached the station. "Everything set?" he asked. "Yes," Elena replied. "Imaging will take over downstairs." Daniel nodded and returned to the computer. Melissa barely looked up from organizing supply drawers. The bed rolled smoothly past the station and toward the elevators at the end of the corridor. From a distance, it appeared exactly like every other patient transfer that happened throughout the night. But as the elevator doors opened, two men in plain clothes were already waiting inside. Their posture was calm, but alert. Elena guided the bed into the elevator without hesitation. The doors closed quietly behind them. For a moment, none of them spoke as the elevator began descending toward the lower floors. One of the men glanced briefly at the patient before looking toward Elena. "Agent Carter," he said quietly. Elena gave a small nod. The man on the bed shifted slightly, careful not to strain his injured shoulder. "So, that's the name," he murmured. The second agent watched the floor numbers change above the door. "Perimeter is secure," he said to Elena. "No complications." Elena kept her eyes on the control panel. "Good." The elevator stopped at the service level beneath the main hospital floors. When the doors opened, several federal officers were already waiting in the corridor. The lighting here was brighter, the environment more controlled. Elena pushed the bed forward into the hallway. The officers moved with quiet professionalism, positioning themselves around the patient without raising their voices. One of them secured restraints gently around the man's wrists, careful not to aggravate his injuries. The man did not resist. He looked toward Elena one last time. "You protected your patients," he said calmly. Elena did not respond. She simply stepped back as the officers prepared to move him toward the secured transport vehicle waiting outside. For a moment, the corridor was filled only with the quiet sounds of movement, wheels rolling across the floor, soft radio communications, the steady hum of hospital ventilation. Then the team began escorting the patient away. Elena remained where she stood until they disappeared through the security doors at the end of the corridor. One of the agents approached her afterward. "Command wanted to thank you," he said. "Your call prevented a breach inside the ward." Elena removed the disposable gloves from her hands and dropped them into a nearby bin. "The patients come first," she replied simply. The agent nodded. "Your shift isn't over yet, is it?" Elena glanced at the clock mounted on the wall. 3:24 a.m. "No," she said. Without another word, she stepped back into the elevator and pressed the button for the recovery ward floor. When the doors opened again upstairs, the hospital looked exactly as it had before. The corridor lights glowed softly, monitors hummed behind closed doors. Daniel was still working at the nurses' station when she returned. He looked up briefly. "Everything go smoothly?" he asked. Elena placed the empty chart back into its slot. "Yes," she said. Daniel nodded and returned to typing. The rest of the shift passed quietly. No alarms sounded. No one raised questions about the patient who had been transferred during the night. By the time the first pale light of morning began appearing through the hospital windows, the tension that had surrounded the building hours earlier was gone. Federal vehicles had already left the perimeter streets. The hospital parking lot looked ordinary again. At 6:58 a.m., Elena finished her final chart entries and removed her name badge from the station terminal. The day shift nurses were arriving, greeting each other with quiet morning conversations. Daniel stretched his arms and leaned back in his chair. "Another long night," he said. Elena gathered her things from the locker room and walked toward the exit hallway. No one stopped her, no one asked questions. To the staff around her, she was simply the night nurse finishing another routine shift. Outside the hospital entrance, the morning air felt cool and still. Elena paused briefly at the top of the steps and looked back at the building. Patients inside were waking up. Doctors were beginning their morning rounds. The hospital was returning to its normal rhythm. Somewhere far from the building, the man from room 310